She was just a stray dog, covered in mud, trembling beneath a broken willow tree, until a baby girl crawled toward her in the rain. What happened next would change an entire town. A forgotten mother. A helpless newborn. And a bond that would heal wounds no one could see. This is the story of how a whisper from the woods turned into a chorus of love, of how one golden retriever didn't just survive, she saved. Stay with us, because what you're about to witness is no ordinary rescue. It's a miracle in fur and silence. The town of Willow Creek, nestled in a secluded valley of Vermont, wore its mourning like a woolen shawl, damp, quiet, and gray. Spring rain had been falling steadily for 2 days, soaking the lawns and softening the earth until it yielded easily underfoot. Fog moved like silent ghosts through the tree-lined streets, clinging to rooftops and whispering through the leaves of the great willow tree that stood at the corner of the Holden backyard. Inside the modest white house with faded blue shutters, Grace Holden stood at the kitchen sink, drying a coffee mug with one hand while keeping a cautious eye on her daughter, Ellie Mae, who had just learned to crawl with alarming determination. Grace, 29, was a tall and slender woman with tired eyes the color of riverstone, her auburn hair tied loosely in a messy bun. The past year had carved quiet strength into her face. After a sudden divorce and a move across 3 states, she was learning to breathe again in a place that smelled of pine and rain. Ellie Mae, 13 months old, was a chubby-cheeked explorer with wild honey-blonde curls and impossibly blue eyes. She gurgled happily as she crawled toward the sliding glass door, smacking her small hands against the pane while peering into the fog. Grace smiled faintly and leaned down to open the door. "All right, my little adventurer. But only the porch. It's muddy out there." Ellie didn't listen. No sooner had the screen door clicked shut behind them than Ellie took off, her tiny knees thumping against the damp wood of the porch before plunging boldly into the wet grass. The drizzle kissed her cheeks, and her oversized yellow raincoat flapped around her like a small parachute. Grace followed quickly, half amused, half concerned. "Ellie, honey, where are you going?" Ellie made no sound. Instead, she moved with uncanny purpose, crawling directly toward the large, overgrown willow that drooped over the back corner of the yard. The ground there dipped slightly, forming a shallow bowl where rain collected and earthworms rained. Grace rarely let Ellie play near that patch. It had always felt too shadowed, too quiet, as if the willow itself kept secrets. Today, that feeling returned with force. Ellie stopped just short of the tree trunk and sat back on her heels. Her expression changed, not fear, not confusion, but something close to awe. She tilted her head. Then, from the other side of the fence, something moved. A snout, caked in mud and shaking slightly, emerged through the low brush. It was the nose of a dog, golden fur darkened with wet soil, tongue lolling to one side, breath heavy and labored. Then came the eyes, amber, wide, and desperate. Grace froze. "Ellie, get back." But her daughter reached forward, her tiny hand gently resting on the damp fence. She giggled. The dog didn't bark. Instead, she did something Grace would never forget. She disappeared for a moment behind the brush, and when she returned, she was carrying something gently in her mouth, a tiny, squirming puppy, so small it looked like a curled leaf in her jaws. "Oh my God," Grace whispered. The dog, a golden retriever, thin and trembling, placed the puppy softly on a dry patch of moss and vanished again into what looked like a shallow den hidden beneath the willow's hanging branches. Grace scooped Ellie up in her arms and backed away slowly, heart hammering. She turned and ran for her phone. 10 minutes later, an old screen door banged open next door. Martha Bell, 68 years old and the unofficial watchwoman of Willow Creek's North Block, emerged from her back porch in a flower-print housecoat and rain boots. Her gray hair was tied into a loose braid, and a cigarette dangled unlit between her lips. She had lived in Willow Creek her whole life, and nothing surprised her anymore. Until today. Grace met her at the shared fence, holding Ellie tightly. "Martha, I think there's a dog stuck under the willow tree. And she's got puppies." Martha's eyes narrowed. golden retriever? Yes. Well, I'll be. That sounds like Sunny. Sunny? She belonged to the Hamilton family, down by Maple Street. Went missing after that bad storm last month. Folks assumed she was hit on the highway or, worse. Martha squinted into the fog. You say she's under the tree? Yes, and I think she's trapped. She keeps going down into this hole, but it's muddy. She looks exhausted. The older woman didn't hesitate. She was across the yard in seconds, rain boots squelching through the mud. I'll get my flashlight. And my son. And call the vet. You go get towels. Grace returned to the yard with 3 blankets and a shovel. She handed Ellie off to Martha's grown son, Cal, who had arrived moments later in a muddy pickup. He was a thick-set man with a kind face and permanently dirty jeans, the sort who worked with his hands and never looked surprised by anything, except the sight of 6 golden puppies slowly squirming in a half-flooded hollow. The main tunnel under the willow was collapsing, the waterline rising with each passing minute. Sunny, her ribs visible under matted fur, was now slipping each time she tried to climb out. One paw at a time, she pushed, slid, and growled softly to herself. Grace knelt at the edge of the hole, trying not to cry. She's trying so hard. Cal frowned. She's not going to make it out again unless we help her. She won't leave without the others. No, said a soft voice behind them. It was Martha, returning with a thermos of coffee and a determined look. Because she's a mother. Rain began to fall harder, drumming on the leaves like a ticking clock. 20 minutes later, Grace was down in the dirt with Cal and Martha, building a makeshift ramp of wooden planks. Sunny had just managed to push her 5th puppy up into a towel-lined box near the fence. She was shaking, drenched, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Her 6th puppy remained below. Suddenly, Ellie, safe in her carrier under a porch awning, began to cry. Sunny lifted her head. And with one final burst of strength, she turned back into the muddy hole. A few minutes passed. Then, from the base of the willow, Sunny emerged one last time, slowly, proudly, carrying her final puppy in her jaws. Grace reached forward with open arms. I've got you, girl. You did it. Sunny collapsed softly into her lap. That evening, in the flickering warmth of Grace's living room, 7 puppies lay bundled in towels, a heating pad humming beneath them. Ellie sat beside Sunny, who had been fed, washed, and wrapped in a fleece blanket. The dog rested her head near Ellie's tiny feet, tail gently thumping every time the baby giggled. Martha sipped her coffee and stared into the fire. Well, she said, I think you just became part of something much bigger than yourself. Grace looked over at her daughter, then at Sunny. I think we all did. The rain did not stop the next day. It became finer, colder, quieter, like a whisper carried by wind over rooftops and the wet grass of Willow Creek. Fog still clung to the town like an old secret, and under its cover, something had shifted, not just in the ground beneath the willow, but in the hearts of its people. Inside the Holden house, the living room had become a nursery. 7 golden puppies slept curled together inside a large laundry basket lined with towels. Their tiny bodies trembled in dreams as Sunny lay beside them on a folded quilt, her head resting on her paws, eyes half open, ever watching. She was still weak, but her breath no longer rattled. Her chest rose with calm purpose. Grace Holden sat nearby, wrapped in a thick sweater, sipping tea. The events of the previous day replayed over and over in her mind like a film, Ellie crawling through the wet yard, Sunny emerging from the earth like a miracle, the neighborhood gathering without hesitation. That unplanned rescue had shaken something loose in her. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. Across from her, Ellie Mae sat upright in her baby seat, eyes fixed on Sunny with laser-like focus. One of the puppies stirred, letting out a sleepy whimper. Ellie squealed softly in response and reached a hand forward until it touched the golden mother's ear. Sunny didn't flinch. She let it rest there. A knock broke the moment. Grace stood and opened the door to find Sheriff Dan Clary on her porch, water dripping from the brim of his weathered Stetson. He was in his early 40s, lean and broad-shouldered, with gray at his temples and a jawline that carried both strength and sorrow. A widower for almost 5 years, Dan had a quiet way about him, like a man still learning how to speak again after a long silence. He offered a sheepish smile. "Morning. I brought this." He held up a bag of kibble in one hand and a newspaper wrapped in plastic in the other. "Didn't think Sonny would want the junk they sell at the corner store." Grace stepped aside. "Come in. They're still sleeping, mostly." Dan wiped his boots and stepped into the warmth of the home. His eyes landed on the basket, and for a moment, something flickered in him. He moved toward it and crouched carefully. "Lord, they're tiny," he said, his voice softening. "You saved them just in time." Grace shrugged. "I think Ellie did. She found Sonny first." Dan looked over at the baby, who stared back at him with the kind of unapologetic curiosity only infants can carry. He tipped his hat politely. "Well, Miss Ellie. Thank you." They sat in the kitchen after, the scent of chamomile and damp leaves filling the space. The conversation wandered, from the rain, to the puppies, to how quiet the town had been lately. Eventually, it found its way to something heavier. "You think she's gonna make it?" Dan asked, nodding toward Sonny. "She's stronger than she looks." "I've been weak like that," Grace replied. "You come back if you have something left to hold on for." Dan didn't reply. But he understood. His silence said so. Later that afternoon, Grace walked across the back fence and knocked on Martha Bell's kitchen window. The older woman shuffled over with her usual dry wit and her floral apron dusted in flour. "I brought banana bread," Grace said, holding it up. "Are you trying to soften me up to keep all 7 puppies?" Martha snorted, but her eyes twinkled. "You'd need a small barn." Grace smiled. "No, just wanted to say thank you. For yesterday. And, for helping me feel like I belong." Martha took the bread and waved her off. "You saved lives, honey. You belong more than most." As they stood in the doorway, a delivery van pulled into the cul-de-sac. From the back stepped a man in a raincoat and glasses carrying a large box. He looked confused. "Sorry, is this the Halden residence?" he asked. "Yes," Grace said, stepping closer. "Can I help you?" Package from Golden Paws Shelter Foundation. Someone anonymously donated a full care kit, food, medical supplies, even heating lamps, for a litter of rescued pups. Said it was urgent. Grace and Martha exchanged surprised glances. Inside the box were blankets, collars, feeding bottles, and a note typed in small serif font, "For Sonny, who never gave up. May her strength light others." "No return address?" Grace asked. The deliverman shook his head. "Just said, keep going." Martha chuckled. "Sounds like someone's watching over you." Grace wasn't so sure. But she felt something stir inside her. A sense of being carried. Supported. That evening, as clouds drifted apart and moonlight spread over Willow Creek, Grace sat with Ellie and Sonny near the window. One of the puppies, the smallest, had been fading through the day. She named him Bruno, the brave one, and held him gently against her skin under her sweater to keep him warm. Ellie leaned against Sonny, her baby arms awkwardly wrapped around the mother dog's neck. Sonny lifted her head slightly and pressed her nose to Ellie's temple. It was not just affection. It was gratitude. That night, Grace dreamed of willow trees whispering names into the wind, and of quiet paws walking through fog, carrying hope in their jaws. Morning rose with silence. The rain had stopped sometime in the early hours, and now the skies over Willow Creek were a soft, pewter gray. Dew clung to every surface, each blade of grass, every wooden fence post, the edges of the sleeping willow tree that had cradled secrets for days. The town had paused, as if holding its breath. Inside the Holden living room, time was also holding still. Bruno, the smallest of the golden puppies, lay nestled inside Grace's robe, his heartbeat fluttering against her chest like a trapped bird. His breaths were shallow, too shallow, and despite the heat lamp and warm bottles and sleepless vigilance, his strength continued to fade like the echo of a lullaby. Sunny hadn't moved from Grace's side all night. The other 6 pups slept under the glow of the warming pad, healthy, round, and gently snoring. But Sunny only had eyes for the one tucked into Grace's arms, the one who hadn't yet given up. "Come on, little fighter," Grace whispered, tears caught in her voice. "You've made it this far." Across the room, Ellie Mae sat on a blanket near the basket of puppies. Her hair was tousled, a cereal puff stuck to her cheek. She wasn't smiling. Her blue eyes, so often full of mischief, now fixed solemnly on her mother and the tiny life in her arms. Then she did something unexpected. Without making a sound, Ellie crawled across the floor, stopping just beside Grace. She leaned in, placing one chubby hand on Grace's chest, right over where Bruno lay. Her head rested gently against the curve of Grace's shoulder. And for a moment, brief and weightless, Grace felt something shift. The puppy stirred. Sunny lifted her head. And Grace could have sworn the room itself inhaled. By noon, the little one's breathing had deepened. Not steady, not strong, but deeper. Hopeful. Grace didn't allow herself to speak it aloud, afraid the words might undo the fragile spell of survival that seemed to be holding him together. She placed a call to Carlos Whitman, the town's only vet. The voicemail clicked on before the first ring. "Hey, this is Carlos. I'm doing house calls this week for the shelter dogs. Leave a message, if it's urgent, text me." Grace hung up, sighed, and opened a new message. "Smallest pup is struggling. Breathing improved but still weak. Can you stop by today? Grace." She hesitated, then added. "His name is Bruno." A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. Grace, startled, wiped her face and opened the door. Dan Clary stood there again. This time, holding a box of pastries and a thermos of black coffee. "I thought you might need a break," he said simply. Grace stepped aside, her throat tight. "You have a sixth sense for timing. I've got teenage nieces. They cry at puppies. I learned to read emotional atmospheres," he said with a half-smile. He followed her into the kitchen, where Sunny greeted him with a slow wag and tired eyes. Bruno was now curled in a soft towel on Grace's lap, his breathing deeper but his body still limp. Ellie sat quietly beside them, oddly still for a toddler. Dan's smile faded when he saw the puppy. "That the one?" "Yeah. His name's Bruno. He's the fighter." Dan nodded and crouched low. "He's got the right name. Let's hope he lives up to it." They sat for a long time in that room, not talking much. Dan helped make eggs and toast. Grace took 3 bites, more than she'd eaten since yesterday. Sunny nuzzled Bruno gently and licked Ellie's cheek, who giggled quietly but didn't leave her spot. Then, just as Grace stood to rinse a plate, her phone buzzed. "Carlos W., on my way. Tell Bruno to hang in there." At 2:30, Carlos arrived with a battered satchel and a kind smile. In his late 50s, he looked like someone who had weathered all kinds of animal heartbreak and yet still believed in miracles. His hair was graying and pulled back in a ponytail, and his jeans were perpetually smudged with fur. He gently examined Bruno, running his fingers along the puppy's ribs and checking his gums. Grace watched with bated breath. Carlos's expression remained unreadable. "Well," he said finally, wrapping Bruno back in the towel. "He's colder than I'd like. But he's got fight in him. What you're doing, skin to skin, fluids, warmth, it's textbook." He looked up at Grace. "But you're doing something else too." Grace blinked. "What do you mean?" Carlos tilted his head. This house has heart. And that matters. Sometimes the will to live comes from the room we're in. From who's holding us. Sunny, as if understanding, laid her head gently on Grace's knee. As the afternoon light softened to gold, the neighborhood began to stir again. Martha Bell arrived with a box of old baby blankets and a large pot of soup. Cal dropped off a bag of firewood. Even Mr. Royce, the retired librarian who rarely left his porch, walked over to leave a box labeled, "Warming Herbs and Oils," just in case. The house became a gathering place. A silent agreement had formed. What had happened under the willow tree was no longer just Grace's story. It belonged to all of Willow Creek. That night, Grace curled up on the couch with Ellie asleep on her chest and Sunny at her feet. Bruno, bundled in a towel next to her, let out a tiny sneeze, then another. Grace startled. And then, for the first time all day, the little pup let out a high-pitched, breathy yip. It was soft. But it was strong. Sunny raised her head. And Grace exhaled a laugh wrapped in tears. Outside, the willow tree swayed under the starlit sky, its leaves shimmering like secrets. And though no one else heard it, Grace could have sworn the wind carried a whisper. Hold on. The days that followed unfolded with the rhythm of healing, slow, uneven, but steady. In Willow Creek, the spring sun returned, peeking through pale clouds and drying out the earth. Puddles retreated. The great willow tree behind Grace Halden's house, once weeping into the mud, now shimmered with new green leaves curling toward the light like hands in prayer. Inside the Halden home, Bruno was thriving. The smallest of Sunny's 7 puppies had transformed. No longer just the fragile one, he had begun to explore with wide eyes and a wobbly swagger. His golden fur was still thinner than the others, but his tail wagged with vigor, especially when Ellie Mae approached. The toddler now spent most mornings on the floor, surrounded by wagging bodies and tiny barks, her giggles ringing like wind chimes through the house. Grace often watched from the kitchen doorway, one hand curled around a coffee mug, the other resting unconsciously over her heart. Sunny lay near the hearth, gaze always fixed on her pups, and more often, on Ellie. There was something in her eyes. Not just watchfulness, but understanding. As if she'd assigned herself a second litter to guard. One Thursday afternoon, Grace opened the front door to find Dan Clary on the porch again, this time without his sheriff's jacket, in jeans and a denim shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He carried a small tool bag and smiled in that quiet, self-conscious way of his. "I heard your porch light's still out," he said. Grace stepped aside. "That's your excuse to visit today?" "Nope," he said. "Today I'm just a man with tools and a very complicated reason to be near you." Grace raised a brow. "Which is?" Dan looked past her, toward the living room where Ellie was lying in a pile of puppies, her tiny hand resting on Bruno's back like a queen among cubs. "I keep thinking about her," he said. "And you. And that dog. I think something's happening here. I just don't want to miss it." Grace said nothing for a moment. Then she handed him the light bulb. That evening, as Dan was fixing the back porch wiring, clouds began to return, not gentle and silvery as before, but heavy, dark-edged, and fast. A storm was coming. Grace stepped outside with a flashlight and a frown. That came out of nowhere. Dan looked up at the sky, now streaked with ash-gray tendrils. "We've had so much rain lately. Ground still soft. Could get messy again." Suddenly, from the back of the yard, Sunny barked. Not loudly, but sharply. Urgently. Grace turned. Sunny was standing near the old willow tree, hackles barely raised, tail stiff. Her gaze was locked on the earth. Dan dropped his tools and moved beside Grace. "Something's wrong," she said. Without speaking, they crossed the yard, flashlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Near the base of the tree, the ground had begun to sink, only slightly, but enough to pull a shoe off your foot if you weren't careful. "Underground water," Dan muttered. We need to keep the dogs away from here. Just then, thunder cracked overhead. A sudden rush of wind bent the willow's long arms downward, and rain began, light at first, then harder. Grace grabbed Sunny's collar gently. "Come on, girl." But Sunny resisted. She barked again and ran toward the basket where the puppies had been napping on the back porch. In a flash of gold, she nudged Bruno gently with her nose and began dragging the blanket he lay on toward the door. Dan and Grace exchanged looks. "She remembers," Grace whispered. "She remembers what it was like last time. The hole. The water. The fight to breathe." That night, Willow Creek was battered by wind and storm. The streets filled with runoff and the power flickered twice before returning, steady but uncertain. Inside the house, Grace lit candles just in case. The puppies were gathered close together in a crate beside the fireplace. Ellie slept upstairs, and Sunny lay in front of the crate, alert but not afraid. Dan had stayed. "You don't have to worry alone," he'd said simply. Now they sat side by side on the couch, the fire flickering between them, casting golden shadows. "You know," Dan began after a while, "when my wife died, I didn't think I'd ever care about small things again. Like puppies. Porch lights. Neighbors." Grace looked over, saying nothing. "But that little one," he said, nodding toward Bruno, "he reminded me. Some things are worth coming back for." Grace rested her head lightly on his shoulder. "I think he's reminding all of us." At 3 a.m., the storm peaked. Branches slammed against the side of the house. The wind howled. And then came a sound that snapped both adults upright, a loud crack, followed by a hollow, dragging thump. Grace grabbed the flashlight. Dan grabbed the radio. They ran into the yard. The willow tree had lost a large limb. It had fallen across the back garden, right where the puppies had been napping earlier. The earth near the base was soaked through, slumping deeper into a shallow depression. Dan swore under his breath. If she hadn't moved them. Sunny appeared behind them, her fur soaked and her body shaking, but her tail wagged once. She barked twice and ran to the porch door, where she pressed her nose against the glass. Inside, the puppies were safe. So was Ellie. Grace sank to her knees and exhaled a prayer. The next morning, the sky was crystal clear. Birds returned to the branches. The town stretched its limbs in the light. Carlos the vet came by, checking on Sunny and the pups. "All healthy," he said, nodding at Grace. "That little one. Bruno. He's gonna be big one day. You'll see." As Carlos left, Martha Bell came to the porch holding a flyer. "Grace," she said, breathless, "I don't want to alarm you, but look at this." It was a missing dog flyer. A golden retriever. "Sunny. I think you need to call the number," Martha said gently. Grace stared at it. Inside the house, Ellie was laughing, Bruno trying to climb into her lap, his legs still wobbly, but his joy uncontainable. Grace took a deep breath. "I will," she said. "But, not just yet." The sky over Willow Creek was streaked with spring light, ribbons of soft blue and pale gold unfurling over the rooftops like a sigh after the storm. It was the kind of morning that made people believe things could begin again. But inside Grace Halden's kitchen, a quiet war was being waged between her hands and a piece of paper. The missing dog flyer lay on the table beside her half-empty mug of tea. The image was unmistakable: golden fur, intelligent eyes, a gentle face. The name read, Daisy, last seen near Maple Ridge. Beloved family dog. Missing since March 3rd. Please call if found. And below it, a name she didn't recognize. Cynthia Morgan. Grace stared at the flyer while Sunny lay curled at her feet, oblivious, her breathing steady. The puppies played nearby, tumbling over each other like clumsy tumbleweeds. Bruno, now the most curious of the litter, attempted to climb into the cereal box Grace had left half open on the floor. In the playpen, Ellie giggled, tossing a sock in the air and catching it on her head like a crown. Grace bent down and stroked Sunny's back. "I don't know what's right," she whispered. "I just know what feels unfair." Sunny tilted her head, as if listening. That afternoon, Martha Bell stopped by with a pie, apple, thick crust, her way of easing difficult conversations. She sat down without being asked, brushed crumbs off the flyer, and sighed. "I checked," she said. "That Cynthia woman lives in a farmhouse about 20 minutes north. She's a widow. Early 60s. Doesn't go into town much anymore." "Did she say how Sunny disappeared?" "Fence blew open during a windstorm. Daisy bolted, pregnant. Cynthia's been putting up posters for weeks. Most folks just assumed coyotes got her." Grace's hands gripped the mug too tightly. "She thought she was dead." Martha nodded. "You should talk to her." Grace's voice was flat. "What if I don't want to?" Martha softened. "Then you better be ready to live with that." That night, Grace stood by Ellie's crib, watching her daughter sleep. The baby's fingers clutched a corner of her blanket, her chest rising in perfect rhythm with Bruno's tiny breaths beside her. The puppy had begun sneaking into Ellie's room each night, curling at the base of her crib like a silent sentinel. Sunny never seemed to mind. She only watched from the doorway. Grace whispered aloud, though the child was dreaming. "She found you. You found her. But someone else is missing her too." Behind her, a soft knock on the door broke the quiet. Dan stood outside, holding a cardboard box. "Thought I'd return your socket set. And the soup container." Grace stepped aside. They sat on the steps beneath the porch light Dan had fixed. "Tell me," he said gently. Grace told him everything. About the flyer. About Cynthia. About her guilt, her fear of doing the wrong thing. Dan didn't offer easy answers. "Sometimes," he said, "doing the right thing breaks your heart a little." Grace looked at him, and for the first time in days, allowed herself to cry. The next morning, she drove to Maple Ridge Farm. Ellie sat in the back, sleepy and confused, with Bruno dozing beside her in a basket. Sunny rode in the passenger seat, ears perked, but tail still. The road wound through open fields, past red barns and fences weathered by time. When they reached the long gravel driveway, Grace hesitated before pulling in. The house was old but loved. There were flowers planted in wild, joyful beds. A faded wind chime spun near the porch. As she stepped out of the car, the front door opened slowly. An older woman emerged, short, round-shouldered, with gray curls and eyes that squinted into the light. She clutched a tissue in one hand and the doorframe in the other. "Are you?" "I'm Grace Holden," she said quietly. "I think I have your dog." The woman covered her mouth. And Sunny, without hesitation, leapt from the car. But instead of running, she approached slowly, measured. Cautious. She stopped at the foot of the porch steps. The woman whispered, "Daisy." And Sunny sat. Grace held her breath. Then, in a moment that would replay in her heart for years, the woman crouched down and opened her arms. Sunny leapt into them. They sat on the porch afterward, Grace holding Ellie, Cynthia petting Sunny with trembling hands. "She's thinner," Cynthia said. "But she's still her. God, I prayed every night." Grace nodded, throat tight. "She had her puppies," she said. 7. Under a tree. In a storm. She saved them. We all helped. Cynthia's eyes welled. "That's her. She always mothered everything. Even the chickens." They sat in silence. Then Cynthia looked at Grace. "I can't take them from you." Grace blinked. "What?" "She chose to stay with you. To birth her babies with you. She came back to me to say goodbye. But I think she's already home. Grace started. Cynthia continued. But can I visit sometimes? Grace nodded. You're welcome anytime. Back in Willow Creek, Sunny trotted into the house ahead of everyone, tail wagging, nose lifting toward the kitchen. She sniffed every corner as if reacquainting herself with what was already familiar. Bruno barked once and pounced on her paw. Ellie clapped. And Grace smiled. For the first time, I smiled fully. That night, the family gathered again on the couch. Dan brought chili. Martha bought brownies. Carlos came by to weigh the puppies. Even Mr. Royce dropped off a poetry book for the dog. They raised their glasses of ginger ale. To Sunny, Dan said, "Who chose twice?" And to Grace, Martha added, "Who answered both calls?" And to Bruno, Carlos laughed, "Who never gives up." Then Grace turned to Ellie and said, "And to you, my love." Ellie just laughed and held up Bruno's paw. As if he, too, had something to say. Spring arrived for real the following week. The ground firmed. The sun came out and stayed. Daffodils opened along the fences. The old willow behind the Halden house unfurled its green fingers again, not just drooping, but dancing. The wounds from the storm had faded, and the great limb that had fallen now served as a play structure for puppies and toddlers alike. Everything was in bloom, and for the first time in a long while, so was Grace. She moved through her days with a quiet rhythm, bottle-feeding the puppies when needed, chasing Ellie across the yard, answering calls from neighbors who now seemed more like family. Her laughter came easier. Her silences were no longer heavy. Something had rooted inside her. Something that whispered, "You're not alone anymore." Bruno had become the unofficial mayor of the backyard. He led his siblings through the grass like a pint-sized explorer, yapping at butterflies and falling over his own feet. He slept with Ellie every night now, curled at the foot of her crib or nestled behind her knees. And every morning, Sunny waited just outside the bedroom door, eyes trained, ears alert. She was still lean, but her golden coat shone again, and the softness in her gaze had deepened into wisdom. She moved with the presence of a creature that had survived more than she could speak, and had chosen joy anyway. On a breezy Saturday morning, Grace and Dan stood beneath the willow, watching Ellie try to teach the puppies to roll over. Most of them were content to flop onto their backs and wiggle. Bruno, naturally, attempted a backflip and landed in a mud patch. Dan chuckled and shook his head. "That one's gonna be trouble." Grace leaned against him lightly. "He already is." Dan looked down at her. "You know, if I didn't know better, I'd say you've gotten used to the chaos." Grace smiled. "It's the first time chaos has felt like home." They stood in silence, watching life unfold, wet noses, laughter, the sunlight caught in Ellie's curls like spun sugar. Then Dan cleared his throat. "I've been thinking." "Uh-oh," Grace said, grinning. "About staying. Permanently." Grace blinked. "Dan, you already live here." "I mean really staying," he said, eyes soft. "Not just helping. Not just visiting. I want to be part of this." He gestured at the yard, the house, the messy miracle of it all. "I want to build something with you." Grace didn't answer at first. She just reached for his hand. And didn't let go. By May, 6 of the puppies had been adopted into homes around Willow Creek. Every one of them went to a family that had helped with the rescue or been touched by it in some way. Martha took the quietest one, Carlos adopted a pair together, even Mr. Royce, stoic as he was, took in the floppy-eared pup he secretly named Sonnet. Only Bruno remained. And he was exactly where he belonged. The town held a small celebration that month beneath the willow tree. They called it Sunny Day. There was lemonade and music and a hand-painted banner strung across the fence that read, "To the dog who dug through darkness and brought us together." Cynthia Morgan came, bringing homemade biscuits and a photo album of Sunny's early years. She hugged Grace, then knelt beside Ellie and whispered something into her ear that made the little girl giggle. Dan cooked hot dogs. Bruno stole 3. And Sunny sat in the shade of the tree, tail curled around her paws, eyes half closed. At peace. That evening, after everyone had left, Grace sat alone beneath the willow, Ellie asleep upstairs, Dan helping pack up chairs. Sunny lay beside her. Bruno rested between her feet. The tree above them swayed softly, leaves brushing the breeze like chimes. You changed everything, Grace whispered to the golden dog beside her. You gave us back what we didn't even know we lost. Sunny blinked once, then rested her chin on Grace's knee. Grace ran a hand over her head. I used to be afraid of the silence, she said. Now I think it's just where miracles begin. She looked out over the yard, over the flowers, over the fence that once separated her world from another. Thank you for digging your way in. Sunny didn't move. But Grace swore, just for a moment, she saw her tail wag. That night, in a house that once echoed with emptiness, Grace tucked Ellie into bed, turned off the lights, and climbed under the covers with Dan beside her. Bruno settled in at the foot of the bed. Sunny curled on the rug near the door. And from somewhere beyond the window, the willow whispered. Not an ending. Just a beginning. In the weeks following Sunny Day, Willow Creek felt lighter, as if the town itself had inhaled deeply and remembered how to exhale. People lingered longer at the market. Strangers waved. New friendships sprouted in the cracks left behind by old habits. Grace often caught herself smiling without reason, a mug of coffee cooling in her hand while the early sun spilled through her kitchen window. But something else was happening, too. Something quieter. And it began with Ellie. She was always an observant child. But now her gaze seemed older, focused, almost knowing. She would sit for long moments, staring out the window at the yard, lips pursed, her fingers brushing over Bruno's fur in rhythm with his breathing. She spoke more in gestures than in words, and when she did speak, it was often to the animals. Soft things. Words that felt like secrets. And Bruno, still the smallest, still the boldest, would respond in kind. He watched Ellie with unwavering loyalty, mimicking her moods, following her like a silent echo. If Ellie laughed, Bruno barked. If she frowned, his ears would fold back and he'd lean into her. But it was Sunny who noticed it first. One afternoon, Grace found them in the yard, Ellie sitting cross-legged, Bruno pressed to her side, and Sunny standing just behind, head lowered, eyes locked onto Ellie, not protectively, but expectantly. As if waiting for something. As if, listening. Grace watched them for a long time. She said nothing. But her heart beat louder than the wind. One morning, something strange happened. Grace was on the phone in the kitchen when she heard Sunny bark, not loudly, not urgently. Just once. Measured. When she stepped into the living room, she found Ellie on the floor, curled up, eyes closed, her breathing unusually shallow. Bruno was pawing at her shoulder, whining. Sunny stood over them both, tail stiff, her body tense. Grace rushed forward. Ellie, she cried, kneeling. Sweetheart, wake up. Ellie stirred slowly, her cheeks pale, a light sweat beading her forehead. Her lips trembled, but she blinked and murmured something soft, something Grace barely heard. She told you, Ellie whispered, pointing a small finger at Sunny. She said I was going to fall. Grace didn't question it. Not out loud. She just held her daughter and watched as Bruno nuzzled his face into her side and Sunny exhaled a long breath through her nose, as if a prophecy had fulfilled itself. Carlos came that afternoon, checked Ellie over with care. No fever. No sickness. Just a small fainting spell, likely caused by mild dehydration or the heat. But keep watching, he said to Grace with a knowing look. Sometimes kids feel more than we expect. Later, After Carlos had gone and Ellie was napping, Dan arrived with lunch and that calm voice that always seemed to bring clarity. "She told me Sonny warned her," Grace said as they sat under the willow. "And Sonny barked right before it happened. As if she knew," Dan finished. They sat in silence. Then Dan added, "Maybe this story isn't over." Grace nodded. "No. I don't think it's even begun." That night, when the house was quiet and the stars had stitched themselves across the black sky, Grace sat in Ellie's room. Sonny was at the foot of the bed. Bruno curled against Ellie's ribs. And Grace whispered into the hush. "Whatever it is that ties you together, keep it strong. Keep it good." As she stood to leave, Sonny opened one eye, watching her with something deep and old in her gaze. Grace paused. "You were never just a rescue, were you?" Sonny didn't move. But Grace could have sworn she blinked once. As if to say, "Neither were you." Outside, the willow swayed in the windless dark. No storm. No sorrow. Just a silence that hummed with what comes next. Not all miracles come with thunder or light. Some arrive quietly, in muddy paws, in a child's touch, in the breath between two heartbeats. Sonny wasn't just a dog in need. She was a messenger, a guardian, a spark of healing wrapped in fur. And little Ellie wasn't just a baby, she was the beginning of something none of them could yet understand. This story reminds us that love doesn't always need words. That the most profound bonds are often felt, not spoken. And that sometimes, the smallest gestures, reaching out, staying close, simply noticing, can change lives in ways we never imagined. So if this story touched something in your heart, share it with someone you love. Subscribe to keep hearing these stories of hope. And if you believe in the quiet miracles around us, leave a comment below. Amen. May God bless every soul who chooses love over fear, and kindness over silence.